All right, welcome everybody. I'm Random. I'm here with Josh City from 86Boxing. We're going to do a little Prime versus Prime show here. Jack Dempsey versus Jack Johnson. Some Jack on Jack violence. 86. Firstly, welcome. Secondly, what are your initial thoughts on this matchup between these great fighters?
Salute there, Random. Happy to be here once again. So this is a very intriguing matchup. I ended up posting a poll on the channel, and right now, of course, Jack Dempsey is winning this matchup. I think it's one of the more intriguing matchups in the sport of boxing when thinking about the heavyweight division. And had some things ironed out properly, we may have gotten this contest there in the 1910s. But of course, that was just one of those situations where, and I apologize, yeah, I had my background on, but yeah, essentially, it was a situation where timing kind of derailed things in some sense, with Jack Johnson being a bit older than Dempsey, and ultimately, I think that had they fought with neither of them essentially being in their prime, or with Dempsey being the younger, fresher fighter, then that would have spelled trouble for Jack Johnson for sure, just given the dynamics of how that works with youth in sports, etc. But that being said, there are a number of opinions on this particular contest, and I think that these are two polarizing fighters as well. So that always adds an extra bit of fluff on things. And you know how that is when we think about the likes of an Ali versus Marciano. We think about Lewis versus Johnson, Lewis versus Ali. I think Jack Dempsey versus Jack Johnson falls within that realm and category of fantasy matchups. Of course, we all know that this isn't necessarily something that can happen now here in hindsight. But that being said, it's certainly always good to have these types of conversation because I think that it evokes thought and it has the mind working in a number of different ways, even just from the chat and discussion that is going on here within the chat that I'm looking at. There have been a lot of intriguing points made. So shout out to Joshua Woods and Dan, who have been in discussing their opinions on it, shared some very great points. And it has swayed me in some regards in different facets of the contest in itself. But as far as prime versus prime, hard to get better than this particular matchup and what could have been.
Yeah, man, it'll be quite a thing. So I assume we take like 1918, 1919 Dempsey, like either right before or as he got his championship. That seemed like,
Yeah.
for this kind of stylistic matchup, I don't think it helps to have the later Dempsey a little bit maybe
Yeah.
heavier, less active as a fighter.
No, I agree with
Maybe
you there.
1908, maybe the year he finally got to unify the titles. He's just over 200 pounds at that point, so he's not like heavy, but he's not.
Hey, and you're breaking up a bit there, Random.
When Dempsey was at his most ferocious.
Hey, Random, if you can hear me, you're breaking up a little
this
bit.
particular stylistic matchups like Dempsey. Can you hear me now? Is that any better?
It's just some pausing that is going. I can hear you fine. There's just some pauses that have come about here as you're going through your dialogue.
Oh, I see. Yeah, definitely. Let me know if I'm breaking up anymore. Yeah,
okay, good to go. You're good right now.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think you have Dempsey, great hooker. You know, when he's younger, he's full of fire. It's going to be a tough fight for anyone trying to stop that. But I do think, like, stylistically, like Johnson's defensive brilliance, if we're talking about when Johnson was, you know, sort of like getting filled out his physical form, so he's 200 or more pounds. I think Johnson has the answer in this matchup. Although at his most ferocious, Dempsey was fantastic, but I do think that Johnson's going to be able to do what he does and frustrate those attempts. So I don't know that even at his very best, if Dempsey was adaptable enough to throw Johnson off his game. All the experience Johnson had, all the tough fighters he'd been in there with by 1908 was pretty incredible. I don't know. Do you think Dempsey's power could even things up? Because I mean, Johnson's cleverness is almost unmatched, especially in the big guys. But Dempsey, do you think that power, that speed and power of Dempsey, you think that that attack can offset the sort of the trickiness of Johnson?
Yeah, actually, I personally I do think that Dempsey's power and speed, of course, when he was at his most formidable, he had speed to him as well. I think that could offset some of Johnson's strengths. And I was a bit torn on this. I even mentioned this in the comments because a part of me leans towards the prowess of one Jack Johnson, especially considering what he was able to do on the defensive side. And then I look at the offensive side for Dempsey and what he was able to do during his career, and especially when he was at his peak. And I think that stylistically, there are certain things that make this matchup one that evokes a good deal of thought, just given that you could see some wrinkles, some flaws in both fighters' game that could potentially change the outcome of the contest pretty much at any point. And I think that's something to certainly take into account. Another thing is the timing of the contest in itself. Certainly taking the best versions of both of them while they aren't light years apart as far as years, and they generally fall or cross over in the same era. Certainly, there was some changes in the way the rules were and how certain fights were fought there, especially in the heavyweight division, that came about more so in Dempsey's time. And while we still had some exciting fights prior to such, and those that would lean more on the offensive side as far as the action tied to them, no question, Jack Johnson was one who had the unique ability of fighting at his own pace, and that was one of his strong suits. His ability to control contests, control how the action was fought, control the timing and speed associated with how fighters fought or his opponents fought. And I think that is something that makes it intriguing, especially when thinking about what we know Dempsey brought to the table, really ushering in from an audience mainstream style perspective, the knockout fighter there at heavyweight. And I don't mean in the sense of discrediting like the likes of John L. Sullivan, Bob Fitzsimmons, etc., who came before him, who were very much knockout artists. But when it came to Jack Dempsey, he was one of the ones that really elevated it because of where we were with movie rights at that particular time. And so he benefited from that aspect as well. And I think that is what helped to elevate him from a popularity standpoint, which is something that we had mentioned in a number of different discussions surrounding Jack Dempsey. So the timing was like just right for Dempsey and what you would have sought, because for a Johnson contest, especially when he took the more cautious route, you could be in for a full fight that went the distance, that went long. Of course, he could get that knockout. And as we saw in the case of against Stanley Ketchel, he could get it at any point, depending on the situation. But that being said, the offensive side wasn't necessarily what he brought to the table in his most high-profile fights that were a little bit after or just as the film revolution was starting to peak a bit more. So he didn't benefit from that in full totality in his earlier career, because as we know and we've discussed previously there, Random, the Johnson of, I would say, 1900 to 1903, 4, as he was really coming into his prime there as a young offensive fighter, was more on the offensive side. He was more offensively leaning, and I think having more of that version of Johnson on film might have painted a different picture. While we do have accounts and things of that nature, just from a visual standpoint, there are certainly some glaring differences when you look at the likes of a Johnson contest versus a Dempsey contest. And some of that was strategic on Johnson's part. But I do think that Jack Dempsey just ushered in that audience that took the game to a next level. And I think it was more so the rawness and his offensive aggression that was a major part of that.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, once Dempsey really got going, he was big with the finishes, and the public loved it. And after the sort of the relative frustrations of the latter part of Johnson's
coming in
where he
broken up
wasn't
again there, Raymond.
that active, and Jess Willard's into. Yo, my fault, 86. How's that?
Yeah.
Is that any better?
You now. Yep. I hear you.
Cool,
Loud and
cool.
clear.
Yeah, so Dempsey really took the world by storm, and it was there at the right place, right time to maximize how he could capitalize on what he had done. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's pretty. When he was in that offensive mode, it was pretty intense. I do think that Johnson was the Johnson will be able to see what's happening and fight him on the counter. Maybe the younger, a bad time of it, maybe has like less chance of schooling like Dempsey, of being able to like play with him, because Johnson did get clever and clever as he went along, got more experience and put on size. So yeah, maybe like at his best, Dempsey, just like Marvin Hart, by being the aggressor, got a somewhat controversial decision over Johnson in 05. Maybe a prime Dempsey could, with that aggression, could maybe win on points, or even better than that, against 05 Johnson. But I think by December 1908, when he's in Australia beating Tommy Burns up, I think that version of Johnson has the combination of attributes that he's not going to get surprised. He's not so old he's going to get stung, or that he doesn't have the reflexes. Maybe not at his fastest, but I think by then Johnson, the combination of attributes, it's going to be tough for Dempsey. Because what happens when those first few methods of attack are frustrated against Johnson? And Johnson's just like, yeah, you can do a lot. You can go through all the effort. Johnson just sort of bats it away, clears the space, throws some uppercuts on the counter, and just does what Johnson does, leaning on guys, pulling on their arms. It's a really tough fighter. I think stylistically it favors Johnson, although dealing with that whirlwind Dempsey attack. No, I shouldn't say whirlwind, but that Dempsey attack, that hooking attack, it was ferocious, and he had a lot of pop. Dempsey wasn't some sort of lumbering guy. When we're talking about Dempsey at his best, he wasn't, he was coming to fight. So if it goes the distance, maybe Dempsey, just based on aggression and volume and the way they line up, maybe Dempsey gets a decision. I don't see him stopping a prime Johnson. I don't think he beats a prime Johnson, but there's definitely a chance there. Because, man, he cracked a lot of chins in that time, 1918, 1919. From his busy year into the year he won the title, got to give him some credit. But I just don't know if this is a good matchup. I think he'd be better off if he were fighting a more upright, formulaic heavyweight, because he did so well against guys like Fulton and Willard, but those Johnson's a little slicker, a little meaning a lot slicker than those guys were on their feet. For talking Johnson is best. I mean, he was much harder to be like, oh, you're taller than me. We're gonna land some of these hooks. Like Johnson was really good at just seeing what was happening and exploiting it. And I think it's a tough one, but do you think, Josh, if the era they fight in makes a huge difference? I'm not sure how big the gloves were that Dempsey's fighting in. I feel like Johnson fought Tommy Burns in 6-ounce gloves, but I could be wrong. Maybe they were 4s.
Yeah, I don't recall the size of the gloves. Of course, we can look and see that they were most certainly smaller. So they might have been, I would imagine, somewhere in between that 4 and 6 ounce range. Just thinking about it from an overall perspective. And real quick, I want to say shout out to Placido Benelli. That's very interesting. Cheers from Italy. Look to Italy. A lot of great fighters have come out of Italy. And shout out to Max Duran as well, who are in here along with Joshua Woods and Dan. Then Max mentions Prime Johnson, better resume, and style is wrong for Dempsey. Good stuff. Yeah, it's kind of leaning towards the line of random there. So what I will say that, yeah, I do think the era makes a huge difference there, as you noted, random. I think in Johnson's era, at least when he was at his best, when he was fighting his best fights, or at least his most high-profile fights, I think there was a level of holding that was allowed that would have differed a bit towards Dempsey's like prime and when he got a little further on in his career, even though he was less active, so we didn't get to see a ton of Dempsey during that period. I'm thinking post 1919, really. And the era that could be a game changer. Like if Johnson were fighting Dempsey in, say, 1926 or something of that nature, would he be allowed to really hold and control Dempsey in the same manner we saw him do with the likes of Jim Flynn, what he did with the likes of Stanley Ketchel, Tommy Burns, etc.? Pretty much the majority of individuals he fought, at least what we have on film, where he was allowed to control them and really nullify their offense with the level of holding, I would say, that wouldn't be as admissible here today, though we do see holding here today, and sometimes it can depend on the referee as far as the leverage and the leniency surrounding how much one is allowed to get away with. So I think the eras do play a role. So that's to the benefit of both fighters in their respective eras, because of course for Dempsey, him having more free range and control is going to play suit or play in his favor versus if Johnson is allowed to get away with a level of holding and control that he did in his era. And you could say the same in a countermeasure as far as Johnson. Yes, of course, he would prefer to be able to nullify Dempsey's game, stop what his best features were, which were on the offensive side, though I do like and acknowledge and give respect to that Dempsey role that he employed as well. But certainly if Johnson was able to really be in his bag on the defensive end, he could have slowed Dempsey down a great deal. Now, you did mention Johnson's ability to exploit things on the defensive end, so that has to be factored in when thinking about the matchup as whole. And you also noted Dempsey being a bit more fluid in some sense compared to some other heavyweights than what were fought during that era. Some of the bigger guys, or you more so mentioned it from the standpoint of Johnson or Dempsey knocking out some less fluid, more formulaic heavyweights. I think, yeah, the same applies kind of for both. As far as Dempsey, certainly he could get those guys out of there. You think about Willard, as you mentioned, Fulton, first round knockout there. And Dempsey, he usually thrived well against bigger guys who had probably more power, but necessarily didn't have the movement and overall skill set that Dempsey had. But by that same token, we know if he took on a guy who was lighter, more in his range, for instance, who was coming up in weight, he would seem to do pretty well with them as well. Just thinking about the likes of Tommy Gibbons. And I think that has to be factored in. But the interesting part is the Tunney fight kinds of clouds things to a certain degree with Dempsey, because while I'm a believer that he was not at his best at that particular time, let's be honest, he was not very active. He had other outside interests. Money was great. And therefore, those Tunney contests just came at a time in his life where it wasn't that same guy. Certainly not the Manasseh Mauler that we fell in love with and became accustomed to there when he really hit his peak. So that can cloud things a bit because of the fact that we saw Dempsey get so thoroughly outboxed in that contest, or in each of those contests where he fought Tunney, where you could argue he only won a round out of the series of 20 rounds. So I think they were both 10 rounders each. So that's something that could cloud judgment somewhat. But of course, Johnson didn't move exactly the same as Tunney. Tunney was a bit lighter than Johnson, especially as Johnson got up there in years. And I think that's something we have to look at. So Johnson would employ a bit of a different strategy, and Johnson would look to get on the inside, and that's where he would like to control things on the defensive end. As for Tunney, of course, he would control things from the outside when thinking about his defense, with his defense being primarily his elusiveness, ability to dip and duck these punches and really stay out of the range of what was Dempsey's strong suit at that time. So you think about that, there's an interesting clash there, the interesting dynamic between the two, because Dempsey ideally would like to be there where he's had you right there at mid-range, and he can start to tee off and really let off his best on the offensive end. And by that same token, when you're there in that range, that's when Johnson was able to really employ his defense, or deploy it in a manner that allowed for him to really cut off the best offensive attributes that a fighter had. So it makes it very interesting just thinking about it from that standpoint. I know you noted that it could potentially be a decision, things of that nature. I think that if this contest were to have happened, just taking both of them at their best, I think that if Dempsey were to win the contest, it was going to come via knockout, TKO, referee stopping it, some form of that. And to the contrary, while I think Johnson was very much capable of stopping Dempsey depending on the circumstances, I would lean forward more being a decision on Johnson's end, just given how I think he would approach things stylistically. And it would be a slower paced fight for him, as far as if he's able to employ his will in the way that he would want to. But certainly I think that Dempsey offensively has what it takes to be able to stop Jack Johnson. And we know Johnson was stopped at points by different fighters, and certainly circumstances, they could dictate such. When he lost to Chowinski, who was a smaller fighter overall, that was at a time when it was early in Johnson's career. It was a learning experiment for him. Then you take that into account to the point where he lost to Jess Willard, for instance, which is one that is mentioned. Very different Johnson right there, older Johnson, and especially coming to that contest, a mind state that probably wasn't necessarily 100% boxing focus. I mean, that was a Johnson on the heavier side, a less active Johnson, a Johnson with legal ramifications at stake. And this was taking place in Cuba, which was not the home of either of the combatants. But that being said, certainly for Johnson, it would have been a far cry from what he would have been used to being in the States. And as we know, that multi-country tour during the time when he was essentially on the run due to those Mann Act charges, that multi-country tour wasn't as successful and lucrative as anticipated because there was so much missed out on and so many fights missed out on that could have taken place back in the United States. So that factors into him coming into that Jess Willard contest. And I think just overall makes it very interesting. So eras, certainly strong points in the overall conversation.
Yeah, well put. I think the more I think about it, I think in a longer fight, just think Johnson had the deeper and broader experience. And look at Dempsey's fight, like a lot of his experience was after the loss to Jim Flynn, which he avenged brutally the next year. But after the loss to Flynn, Dempsey sort of switched up the thing, but he had a lot more shorter bookings, some like more 4-round bookings. I think he's fighting in California. And Johnson fought some tough fights on his way up, and his style evolved as he met those different styles. So he had faced guys who were going to come in aggressively at him, and his thing was kind of frustrating that. Johnson wasn't someone who, once he hit his prime, like his peak, wasn't someone who would necessarily lead. He would let someone lead, come to him, and he would punish them for daring to try and close that gap. I mean, he was good at batting punches away, getting his head out of the way, leaning this way and that, rolling with things, and that uppercut. That uppercut was nasty. It wasn't the most powerful punch in the game. It wasn't. I don't think Johnson, the way he fought, didn't produce the kind of power that Dempsey produced with his style. So early in the fight, Dempsey is throwing harder, in my opinion. Johnson might be a little bit heavier, the versions of each we're talking about. I think Dempsey lands with more pop. At the same time, he's also committing a lot more energy and doesn't have the same depth of experience. Like Johnson had fought some dudes by 1908. If you deleted Johnson's world title defenses, like everything he did after, like from 1909 onward, basically when Johnson beat Tommy Burns, if he retired right then, his resume is already very good. He's already fought some real dudes. He's been in there with some guys who are serious. And I just think that's going to serve him well. And the version of him that was like entertainment minded, defensively minded, who's shutting guys down, but not necessarily taking too many risks on the other side. Like when he fought Flynn and Al Kaufman was about 190, 195 pounds, which I think is like Dempsey's range, right? Was Dempsey about 190, 195?
Yeah, probably at his best. Yeah, that was his range. Yep.
Yeah, now Al Kaufman is no Jack Dempsey, but Kaufman was a pretty serious guy and considered a contender, but Johnson absolutely made him look simple as can be. Johnson made Flynn look simple as could be. Flynn was very, very aggressive, more aggressive than Dempsey, but he didn't have the defensive abilities of Jack Dempsey, who's not necessarily known for his defense, but he wasn't particularly hard to hit without getting landed on by the amazing Jack Dempsey. So like the equation was a lot different, I think, with some of the fighters that Johnson had faced and made to look foolish. Dempsey brings more to the table than that. If we're talking Dempsey, like 1918 Dempsey, when he's just finishing dudes, fighting really busy schedule, or even in 19, although I think he took some months off before that Jess Willard fight, so maybe, I don't know if that's made it better or worse for him, a full camp, because he was very busy the year before. But yeah, I think that aggression, early rounds in the fight are going to go to Dempsey, in my opinion, but it's going to be a tough ask to do enough damage to a prime Johnson, who'll be a little bit heavier, much more experienced. It's going to be hard to do enough damage in those early rounds that it actually saps Johnson's gas tank for later on in the fight. And I think the equation, the deeper they go, the deeper the waters get, the harder it is for Dempsey with the way he commits, the energy he's committing to fight the way he fights. Johnson, who's able to switch it up, who had aggressive earlier career and fought some guys who he really had to get through their defense. So he understands offense. It's just that he's more inclined to fight defensively, to exploit someone, to tire them out. So I think if it goes 15, I think Dempsey's going to get tired, but maybe he'll make it. If it's back in Johnson's era with more wrestling and they're scheduled for 25, I think by round 20, Dempsey's going to be in a bad way. I think he's even going to get finished. He's just going to, there's going to be a tipping point in the fight where he's too tired to surprise Johnson. Johnson's got his measure, and then Johnson will start punishing him with the uppercuts. And if it isn't stopped on cuts, I just think he's gonna catch him so much trying to come in, and he's just gonna make him use up his energy. He's gonna do what Johnson was able to do in his prime. But I like Dempsey's chances against the younger Jack Johnson, who was more aggressive. Because then, engaging in a firefight with, say, 1918 or 1919 Jack Dempsey, probably not that good of an idea for someone who's of a similar size. Because Jess Willard against Johnson, and other guys too, but Jess Willard, he was an absolute mountain of a man. But he wasn't very active. So when he fought Dempsey, he wasn't really fine-tuned. He'd been criticized for basically barely fighting. Fought once after winning the title between the Dempsey fight and that. And it was years, and he had one other fight. Johnson seemed, his performances at first at least, through 08, but in 09, 09 and 10, he was still razor sharp. Maybe by 1913 when he's fighting, he's kind of on the run. He's in Paris fighting, battling Jim Johnson. Maybe that version of Johnson is a lot tougher for him. But when Johnson was active and he had that combination of enough youth, he's still in his early 30s, he's not old. Yeah, I see him having the advantage here, but also talking about that best version of Dempsey. I'm not talking about his resume or the long arc of his career. So the very best razor sharp version, Dempsey to me is almost like a Tyson question, a Mike Tyson question. Which version of Iron Mike are you going with? Because the earlier razor sharp version of Iron Mike compared to the later version of Iron Mike, who didn't have as much snap in his jab, wasn't as good with the upper body movement, got hit a lot more, wasn't as fast, headhunted more and threw more bombs. It just wasn't as fine-tuned. I think you could get dramatic differences in the results. As with Iron Mike, the same would be with Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey. So I think there are versions of Dempsey that beat versions of Johnson, especially the younger Johnson with less experience. But there is a point at which Johnson has seen too many guys, too many versions of hookers or aggressive come forward fighters, and he's going to be too much. But I'm not betting on it because it's tough. I see Johnson having an advantage, but it's also, he didn't fight too many Jack Dempseys. Tommy Burns is not Jack Dempsey. I like Jack Dempsey's chances, but at his best, I like Jack Dempsey's chances against Burns, even though Burns goes underrated. But having that size, that height advantage, Dempsey wasn't short. Burns was short. I think he would be able to get it done under similar conditions as Johnson. In Australia, I believe it was outdoor. Was it an outdoor stadium they fought in, right? Yeah, with Burns.
Yep. In Australia.
Yeah. So that might be a factor too. A longer fight if they're in the sun, or I think Johnson's fight against Bill Lang, not a title fight, but I think that was in the rain in Australia. So that would be something. I don't know if Dempsey ever fought in the rain, but yeah, there are a lot of different factors that could affect it. But I think overall, I just lean Johnson if we're talking about 1908 Johnson or the couple years after that when he was still big but still pretty active. He was a finely tuned machine, and he knew how to punish guys. He had a very, very intelligent fight style. He would see what Dempsey was doing. I think he could exploit it, but maybe if they fought 5 times, maybe Dempsey gets one of them because he could really crack. He really had some sting in his punches. I don't want to sell him short or sound like I'm just praising Johnson and then writing off Jack Dempsey. There's a reason he became such a huge star. It wasn't just beating the inactive champ. It was also, he was tearing his way through the heavyweight ranks. And they're always looking for that. They want a heavyweight who's busy and who's destroying people. Jack Dempsey looked like he was that guy. Now he became less active, just as Johnson had become less active, but that doesn't speak to how well he would do when he was like perfectly set up to fight. So yeah, it's a good one, man. I think it's closer than maybe I originally thought about. When I first thought about it, I was like, oh man, Johnson's going to give him some real issues. But yeah, it would be competitive, especially say the first 6 or 8 rounds. If it goes past that, Johnson's advantage is going to increase as the fight goes, I believe. What do you think what about if they fought like the younger, less experienced Dempsey, like 1917 Dempsey, who did okay sometimes. We also, lost to Flynn. What about that versus the younger Jack Johnson, say like a 1903 Jack Johnson who's fighting Denver Martin, Sam McVeigh? I think he'd already fought George Gardner by that point. Although, again, George Gardner, Sam McVeigh, different look than Jack Dempsey. But what do you think about more of like prospect Jack Dempsey versus like the colored heavyweight champ early in his reign, like 1903, 1904 Johnson?
Yeah, that would be an intriguing one right there. You made some good points in your assessment. But certainly that would factor in as well. Dempsey, early on, prospect era, he could struggle at points. We know that he got the lesser end of the series with, I'm trying to think of his name. Oh, yeah, Willie Meehan. And Meehan was a guy who came up from lower weights and all of that stuff. And though these were primarily 4-rounders, between 4 and 6 rounders, for sure some 4-rounders, Dempsey was in that learning phase, and you could argue same with Johnson as well. Even when he was a colored world heavyweight champion, he was still building up to becoming the fighter he ultimately became. And I think that would certainly fare and lean more in the favor of Johnson if you think about more that prospect era Jack Dempsey, the Dempsey that was caught and, depending on the version of the story, knocked out at the hands of fireman Jim Flynn. I think that if you took that Johnson from that period when he was beating the likes, as you mentioned, of Denver Ed Martin, Sam McVeigh, etc., then there will be a slight edge to Johnson. And we know that this was a Johnson who, as I had alluded to earlier, was a bit more offensive leaning, and some of that could have just been dictated by the style he was going against, as mentioned, because you did mention that, of course, some of the guys that he may have went up against weren't necessarily a Dempsey at that particular point, though he went up against some pretty top-level guys from a historical standpoint. So that could factor in. Maybe Johnson approaches it different if he's in there with Dempsey, or if he's in there with an even more aggressive offensive fighter. Certainly a comparable, when thinking about the offensive end, would be Sam McVeigh, who Johnson did get the better of in their contest. Now, that was not a contest that Johnson wanted any part of during his time and reign as champion, and I think for good reasons, though it was reported that Johnson had agreed to fight Sam McVeigh had he become victorious over Jess Willard when they fought in Cuba. I think that contest would have gone down in Cuba, so that would have been their second matchup, and it would have been interesting to see what it would have happened at that particular point. But Johnson was able to defeat a younger, sort of growing Sam McVeigh, and it's kind of easy to see that he could do a similar thing to a Jack Dempsey, who was, like McVeigh, more of an offensive fighter, more of a guy who was a knockout artist in some sense for his time, who could really get guys out of there, had some power.
Yeah, exactly.
Along with the combination of some speed.
Like McVeigh was less experienced at that point, if I can just add in.
Yeah.
McVeigh, but he was already dangerous. He was already one of the top prospects coming out of that California scene. And Johnson did fight him early in his career, and he did school him. And in their last fight, Johnson really turned it up in the 20th and got him out of there viciously. Johnson was capable of being an absolute killer in there. It wasn't his style, it wasn't his approach, and it wasn't what he enjoyed doing when he got in. Once he got the ability to toy with guys for his own and other people's entertainment, he did. But he was capable of some ferocious offense when he wanted to. We saw it in the footage of the Stanley Ketchel fight. Now, Ketchel's like 15 or 20 pounds lighter than Dempsey, and he's no Jack Dempsey. Different style, less controlled aggression, I think, than Dempsey. But when he ticked Johnson off and caught him with that wonderful punch, knocked Johnson down, you saw how long Johnson basically hit him with a two-piece the moment he got up. The next exchange, or right afterwards, within seconds, hit him with a absolute beast of a two-piece and really laid him flat out. Like, Johnson had the capability, but again, landing that on a Stanley Ketchel at that point in that fight, I think it was the 12th round, is different than, was it 10th or 12th round? But that's different than landing on a prime Dempsey. So yeah, I think the younger version of Dempsey gets absolutely destroyed by any version of Johnson, unless you take Johnson from like the 1899, 1900, when he wasn't quite fully seasoned yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the early version of Dempsey that fell for an old Sam Langford trick to fireman Jim Flynn and got schooled and had to like make adjustments to his style and, you know, go to Cali with the 4-round bookings. I think that version is susceptible to any version of Johnson other than Super Green Johnson. Maybe it's more of a toss-up. But I just think Dempsey, his learning curve was pretty steep after the losses. The tough fight against John Lester Johnson, got his ribs hurt, and the Flynn loss. But like when he came back in 18, when he was going about the business of like proving himself like the top contender, yeah, he really, really got it on. So I think with Dempsey, when in his career you catch him, to get the best of Johnson, he really does need to he needs to be the right version of Dempsey. I think more broadly, Johnson has just advantages over Dempsey because of his way of exploiting people and guys who commit their weight. Johnson loved that. Please throw your punches really hard at Jack Johnson, because the harder you throw, you know, and I don't think Dempsey, even like the more seasoned version of Dempsey, I don't think he's going to play an outside game with the jab. I don't think he's going to go Tommy Loughran or Jeff Clark on it and try to, you know, and dance, stick and move. I just don't see Dempsey pulling out that kind of performance that would maybe trouble Johnson somewhat if he was a specialist at hitting and moving rather than coming in and laying the damage. But yeah, boy, that's a good fight. That's, I suppose, on a, you know, I suppose it should be mentioned that although it wasn't true throughout their entire careers when they were the heavyweight champ, neither of these men would fight the top black heavyweight boxers of their day while they were holding that main championship. Not Johnson's colored reign, but 1908, once, you know, he had the guys there to fight. McVeigh, Jeanette, Langford. Dempsey had some options too. He wasn't really interested himself, so
yeah.
That also helps. That also impacts a fantasy matchup, is the fact that once they got to the top, neither of these athletes, these great fighters, but neither of them were particularly eager to jump in there with all of the most dangerous guys. These are not Muhammad Ali type champions. Meaning like Ali, man, that dude was crazy. He getting in there. Or like Joe Louis as champ, where he's like, I need to try and fight everyone. I need to go every city and beat up the top heavyweight and quickly and just see. I just think yeah, the version we use. But if we're going best versus best, yeah, I definitely favor Johnson, because the best version of Johnson line up against Dempsey is going to really frustrate him. Trying to come from below to a guy his own height, because, you know, Fred Fulton and Jess Willard, those are big fellas. Those are tall fellas. Johnson's not that tall, and he doesn't fight tall. Johnson was able to fight out of a crouch if he needed to, but he was crafty. He would custom the attack. He's like a studio musician of the boxing ring, you know. Johnson's like, what do we need here? I can make that happen. You need the Wes Montgomery octaves here, or the George Benson singing along with the thing? I can do that. What do you need? You need some little mandolin style, or you need the Carlos Santana? You want some Eddie Van Halen? Johnson had all the styles. By that 1908 time when he finally got in there with Burns basically took 30,000 win, lose or draw guarantee, put his title up. Johnson, the colored champ, unified it. I think that version of Johnson is going to be a nightmare for any version of Dempsey, but at his very best, the 1918, 1919 Dempsey is going to make it a great fight. I mean, it's going to be fantastic to watch, largely because of Dempsey's style, not Johnson's. Johnson could be in a good fight, but he's going to be forced to. But I think what he was able to show in his fights with like the younger versions of, Jeanette and McVeigh, and also his fight with the smaller version of Sam Langford. Even though he schooled Langford, he had 30 pounds on Langford. It did go the distance, went all 15. But Langford at that time in 1906, Langford is a wonder of the ring. He's not quite hit I think in 1907 or late 1906, Langford hits his early, his prime as far as like his viability up at light heavy or above. But he was already a phenom. Johnson was able to largely control that fight. And so, obviously, he doesn't have that kind of size advantage here, but Johnson had shown that people who didn't have like the various attributes to specifically give him trouble, it's going to be tough on them. Johnson also fought a challenge match with young Peter Jackson, a smaller fighter, middleweight by that time. But the challenge was that Jackson couldn't last the full rounds, and he did last the distance. So I think he might have actually got the winner's end of the purse, but he did not get the best of the action with Johnson. Johnson, he's seen different looks, including smaller, faster guys. Dempsey was pretty fast and had a great power to speed ratio. But Johnson's chin to defensive ability ratio was off the charts. He could take punches too. Johnson had some whiskers on him. He wasn't like a delicate frame, especially by 1908. He's pretty chunky. He's solid. He's a beefy guy.
Certainly.
He's a little bit more robustly built than Dempsey, who's a little bit leaner, I believe.
Yeah. Certainly, at that top end for Johnson, he would have a bit more as a bit more of the frame size.
So that's a wild one right there. I think, both guys.
You're breaking up there, Random.
Resumes, both of them. They did impressive things before they won that, what people call the 1908. A resume, that narrow window, that 1918, 1919, I think it's gonna be pretty ferocious. But again, if we're talking to matching the best version of each, if that's the best version of Dempsey, that 1908, 1909 version of Johnson, who was making, Kaufman look absolutely simple, like embarrassingly easy, or with the Flynn fight. And Flynn was very aggressive, more so than Dempsey. He wasn't as subtle, but Flynn was extremely aggressive. Dempsey learned from that, from getting knocked out by him in their first fight, and got the revenge in very quickly against him, and got other guys. Yeah, I think Johnson is just to be a bit too big, a bit too clever, a bit too good at popping him with that uppercut. When Dempsey tries to commit his weight, Johnson's going to be able to move in and out. The best version of Johnson is still mobile enough to really punish him. But I don't know if there's a finish there within 15 rounds. If it goes further, I think Johnson could get it done. But I don't know if he can necessarily finish Dempsey, because Dempsey didn't have like a bad gas tank. Maybe by the Tunney fight, by that time, he's in that silk pajamas mode, movie star mode, but the earlier, hungrier Dempsey is going to make a real fight of it the whole time. And I think if If Johnson gets him out of there, it's late in the fight, round 20, round 21, something like that. Do you see the chance of one of these guys stopping the other? Like Dempsey could catch him early, of course, and he wouldn't let him off the hook if he did. So maybe there's like a 15-20% chance Dempsey does catch him early in the fight, in the first couple rounds, and able to put him out. But short of that, I think his odds go dramatically down as the fight wears on. Like round 8, Dempsey's not breaking out anything Johnson hasn't already seen, absorbed, processed, and countered, I believe. I just don't think he had the creativity to keep surprising Johnson outside of the first couple rounds. Does that seem reasonable? Or am I selling Dempsey short? I don't want to sell him short or base the fantasy fight just on resume, because it's about the guy that shows up. What does the guy actually do? You don't beat someone with a resume, you do it with your fists.
Yeah. No, I think that's reasonable. I had kind of alluded to it. If there's going to be a stoppage, I think that stoppage is Dempsey. While I didn't necessarily point to the time frame, I think, earlier in the rounds, say we get that aggressive version of Dempsey that we saw from 1919, or you could realistically say, I guess, 1918 onward. If we got that version of him, certainly he could go out there and try and blitz Johnson, and he could definitely catch Johnson. So I think that is a reasonable thing to mention and assess there, that if there were a knockout, it could come early from Dempsey. By the same token, I also kind of lean with you in regards to, I think if it does go the distance, especially if we're talking 20 plus rounds or even 25 plus rounds, then I'm leaning more towards Johnson in that regard, because if it gets to that point, then you will have known that Johnson found a way to slow Dempsey down, in my opinion. And therefore, I think Dempsey could find himself trailing a bit, not having that same mustard on the punches, of course. And therefore, that would probably play into Johnson's favor, especially on the inside, because in all likelihood, Johnson will have at that point taken control of what would be happening as far as the inside game. And as you alluded to as well, with those uppercuts that he had a penchant for on the inside, I think that would lean in his favor and certainly be more of a detraction for Dempsey. But I agree with you in that Dempsey certainly wasn't one of those guys who wouldn't be ready for the occasion and able to take things to the later rounds if need be. We might see, just a little bit less of the offensive prowess on Dempsey's side. And this could in turn into more of the plotting style of Dempsey that we saw against the likes of Tunney, against the likes of I will say Tunney. That was really one good example. Just thinking about in both of those fights, because some of the other ones we have on film, he wasn't necessarily plotting. He was employing that Dempsey role as well. We know Tommy Gibbons didn't necessarily want to exchange with Dempsey, but Johnson, he had a way in which he could just slow fighters down, and you definitely would have to take that into account when thinking about it from an overall standpoint. But by that same token, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Johnson himself catches Dempsey, especially if he spots an opening, a la what we saw with the likes of him against Tommy Burns. If Johnson sees the kill and he wants to go for it, he will most certainly do so. And a lot of that is going to be strategically sourced as far as when he chooses to go for it and really give it his all on the offensive side. Because I think he learned from some of those knockouts that took place earlier in his career, and he started to sort of temper himself as well as his expectations when in there, and really think as a fighter a bit more beyond just, you know, the round at hand, thinking about the latter portion of fights, you know, and how the dynamic could change from that perspective. So those are interesting aspects to take into account overall, just thinking about them both and from a prime for prime perspective. I can certainly visualize an avenue in which both fighters pull off a victory in this contest. I have seen in cases where some heavily lean Dempsey, some heavily lean Johnson, and with you, I think that it's probably somewhere in the middle. They're a bit closer than what it may seem, but I think for those in favor or heavily leaning Johnson or Dempsey otherwise, I think the timing really plays into that, because some of the things that we've pointed out could dictate such. Say, yeah, it's a more seasoned, say for instance, that Tommy Burns version of Jack Johnson, that Jeffrey's fight version of Jack Johnson. Certainly, if he were going up against an earlier version of Dempsey, then I think there's some solace in leaning heavily in favor of that version of Johnson over that version of Dempsey. And to the contrary, Johnson of the Willard fame and times after that versus 1919 Johnson, or 1919 Dempsey rather, I will lean heavily in favor of Dempsey against that version of Johnson, because it's just a slower and out of prime, not necessarily top shape Johnson there, even though, of course, he would still have the IQ that he had. But I think that going up against that young, ferocious version of Dempsey, would have been problems for him, and I would have heavily favored Dempsey. And it can be relative to where and how you view each of these fighters as far as their prime.
And also where they fight. Like, okay, who's the ref? Are they fighting to a ref's decision, or is there two judges and a ref, or is it three judges? I mean, I think Dempsey, I don't know if either of them really fought much with the three-judge panel, but like, say, you know, like Johnson when he lost to, I'm trying to remember where he fought, where in California he fought Marvin Hart when he lost that decision. I think it was 20 rounds. But he was landing the crisp. This is something Sam Langford fell victim to, fighting Jim Flynn, their second fight, which was the first time they fought during the 1910 season. They fought in LA, and Jim Flynn got the newspaper verdict. More of the papers thought Flynn got the best of things. And Langford was pissed. He vowed to never fight in LA again. And they actually, when they rematched, it was somewhere else. So I'm not sure how much, because some people have described the Johnson Marvin Hart fight in 1905 as a like a really bad robbery, but not everyone described it as a robbery. What everyone seems to agree on is Johnson was fighting on the counter very well on the counter. Marvin Hart was fighting a very aggressive come forward game. Some judges and certainly some refs, and also the newspaper decisions liked that. The descriptions of excuse me, in my research, Sam Langford, the descriptions on the ground of, say, Langford's 6-rounder in April 1910 against Stanley Ketchel. Ketchel was being more aggressive, leading some to think Sam was taking it easy on him, or not going for a finish because he wanted the long booking, which had happened with Flynn. Like Flynn, the first of their 1910 bouts went to 10 rounds. 3 days later, they're signed for a 45-rounder. But that one only makes it 8. Sam turns it up a little more when there's more at stake, and he has a stake in the film rights for that, which was actually their third fight, but their second of 1910. The first fight, 1908, Sam shocked the crowd, the California sports, by just destroying Flynn with the utmost ease. But yeah, the second fight was competitive. But so, like, yeah, maybe where they fought, maybe if they fought in a jurisdiction or with a ref, to a ref's decision or newspaper decision where they wanted some aggression. Hey, maybe Dempsey gets a decision because maybe those middle rounds where the fight is beginning to turn, Dempsey still takes those rounds based on aggression. Because Langford, when he lost the newspaper decision to Flynn, he landed the more cleanly, but Flynn threw more and landed more. Just not as much quality work, but more work. And that's gonna, that's pretty much going to make the difference. So under what criteria? As far as a finish, yeah, if it ends early, it's probably Dempsey. If they're fighting prime, Dempsey early, the odds of a finish, it's most likely going to be him. Later in the fight, I don't see late rounds Dempsey finishing late rounds Johnson. He was too brilliant. Johnson really was on another level, man. He's so although he didn't have that many opponents in his career that line up with like the specific attributes of Dempsey, because they're both kind of very singular fighters who epitomize that style that they've each fought in. But it's tough because Johnson could play with people's heads, and Dempsey, he was great, but again, not the same depth and breadth of experience. And that was part of the thing with Johnson and his great contemporaries like Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh, is they were hugely experienced. Like when Johnson, the first time he fought McVeigh, I think McVeigh had maybe 6 fights, all wins, all finishes, maybe even more than 6 fights, 6 that BoxRec has. And I've seen in the paper, he's already a hot prospect. They're already saying big things about him coming up in the California scene. But, McVeigh later on, he has dozens of fights between then and say like 1909 where because I think his first fight with Johnson's 1903. Johnson's just beaten Den Red Martin, who's very underrated and a very tall, rangy fighter. He beats him, and then his first defense of the colored heavyweight title is against McVeigh. And he wins on decision. I think it's a 20-rounder. McVeigh already good, but got even better. Tons more experience. Johnson was another of those guys. So when Johnson was his best, he's fighting Al Kaufman, I think it was maybe 19-1 or something, 19-0. Al Kaufman had a good numerical record, but Johnson had so many dozens more fights, especially when you factor in newspaper decisions. Because if we go to BoxRec, at the top of the BoxRec profile page is the just to a decision. Scroll down or search for them in the listings and you see the newspaper decisions factored in. It makes a big difference because Johnson, to a decision, had maybe 70-something fights. I think I counted earlier, and he had 21 more fights that were to a newspaper decision. Whether or not we count those in like how much each individual person decides to trust newspaper decisions, those are rounds fought. And people who do look at the era know most of the time, newspaper decision fight, they're still trying to desperately to win, especially by finish, because they can't get a decision if there's no finish. So, which does favor certain types of fighters, but yeah, it's Johnson's experience. Just, I think it's going to make the difference here. And I think if you could take 1918 Dempsey and then give him 2 more busy years like his 1918, now he's going to have the experience to trouble Johnson, any version of Johnson. But that isn't what happened. Dempsey won the title, and then he was less busy because he discovered the fame and riches, just like a lot of these guys discovered the fame and riches that comes with being the heavyweight champ.
Actually, not unlike Johnson himself, really.
Same thing. And in fact, Johnson, I think if you were looking at like where is the point past which Johnson is going to be vulnerable to Dempsey, I think it's around the time he was maybe like around, or maybe it would have been just after the Willard fight. If Johnson wasn't going to fight Langford or his other great black contemporaries, I would favor him if he had beaten Jess Willard and didn't retire, as some thought he might, as he sometimes suggested he would. Maybe it is Dempsey that dethrones him in 19. If Johnson does keep fighting and doesn't lose there, and he keeps being selective about who he defends, maybe Dempsey is the guy. But I'm not sure, because by then Johnson would be very past it. But Johnson, during the Willard fight, they still went a long way. Johnson still hit him with some artillery. It's just that Willard was ridiculously rugged and really, really big, physically huge to absorb the power. So even if Johnson is tagging him with some good offensive machinery, like more than his normal approach at that time in his career, Willard could take it. So I don't know. So it's like Johnson could put it on somebody, but I do think Dempsey. Once Johnson slowed down a little bit, Dempsey. Now we're talking. So if you took that 1918 Dempsey, give him 2 more years, busy, he's going to be a problem for any heavyweight, because he's going to put on a little extra weight because he's got the money of being the champ, right? So if he was a pretty busy champ, 5 fights a year or something, I don't know if that would have been the case for Johnson. Johnson had already had an awful lot of fights that we know about. Who knows how many we don't. By 1908, Johnson was very deep in the game. It wasn't quite the same for Dempsey. Johnson already fought. We did talks on Johnson's early career, Josh. He fought a pretty tough schedule early in his career for years. So it's not quite the same. By the time Johnson made his peak in his or made his fame, 1908, when he's like, wow, this is the guy now, he's the man. He'd already done a lot more than what Dempsey did by the time because Dempsey pretty much 1918 was when he made his statement. And then 19, he got his shot and won it.
Yeah.
He might have actually gotten the booking in 18, and then the fight happened in 19, but you know what I mean? Like 18 was the Dempsey's, that he was the killer that year. 19, he re-emphasized that. But then the work wasn't there after that. Same with Johnson. Johnson's wins over fighting like Jack O'Brien, Fireman Flynn, Al Kaufman, Frank Moran. That's not the same as maybe some of the other matchups in his career, I think. I think at that point he had the experience and stuff that relative to his ability, those were easier fights than other ones that he'd had. I mean, imagine being inexperienced, you're fighting a beast like Hank Griffin, or you got to fight Denver Ed Martin, a young Sam McVeigh, who's still an absolute unit. Because when Johnson fought McVeigh, I'm pretty sure Johnson was still in like the 180s in his weight. McVeigh was already 200 pounds. He was already a tank from the get-go. So people say Johnson was always bigger, but he wasn't bigger than Denver Ed when they fought. He wasn't bigger than McVeigh when they fought. He was a little bigger than Jeanette.
Yeah, that's true.
Because that was a younger Jeanette, but it wasn't like. So yes, he was bigger than Sam Langford. Yes, he was bigger than Fireman Jim Flynn. Yes, he was bigger than young Peter Jackson, but he wasn't always bigger.
And at the time,
he would have been bigger than George Gardner too.
I'll just throw that out there. At the time, Denver Ed Martin was the man, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that Johnson could beat him.
Absolutely, and I'm trying to remember on BoxRec. I think Martin was like 16-1 when they fought the first time, and he wasn't like and who knows how many fights he'd actually had, but he wasn't some pushover guy. He's just someone who goes massively underrated, in part because of the racial angle of boxing at that time. I mean, Johnson was the colored heavyweight champ. A lot of writers, not all, because a lot of people just wanted sport. They wanted the best versus the best and no excuses, but a lot of writers treated the colored heavyweight ranks like a B league, the way that light heavyweight at one point was considered like the B league of heavyweights. That's how all the colored heavyweights, and Johnson kind of shattered that myth, but that myth had been preserved with the color line. With Sullivan drawing the line, Corbett drawing the line, and then advocating later for everyone else to draw the line. Fitz drew the line on Bob Armstrong, which I was surprised to see in the papers, but he did. He said, I will not fight Bob Armstrong. I'm drawing the color line on him, but I'll back one of my fighters for any amount against him. So he wouldn't fight him for the title, but he would put his money up to back one of his stable to fight Bob Armstrong. And he also trained with Armstrong. So it's a weird time where guys, champions or contenders would train with and get trained by and coach, trained by fighters that they wouldn't give opportunity to. But they will use their abilities to get ready for the other thing. So it's just partly how it went. So for different reasons, Johnson and Dempsey both didn't have the strongest run once they had what people call the world title. It annoys me that people don't call the colored world title a world title, like just because a lot of writers were dismissive toward it. But like I said, they were calling it the B leagues, right? So how's it going to be reported? They're basically saying, so they say something like, oh, Johnson's like quite probably the best colored fighter in the world, and also one of the best American fighters, American heavyweights. And like, wait, what did you just say? like is always put in dismissive terms. And when he beat Burns, there a lot of guys got really salty about that. But then other people were like, hey man, he's the best. This is the guy. Like there was a tug of war between the racism and like wishful thinking and people who just wanted to be realistic. However they felt about it, they just wanted to be realistic and give credit where it was due. So, but unfortunately, after Johnson's time, during his reign and then after it, the press got more racist. And then you get distortions on what was happening. And so then it gets more polarized. The outliers, there are more outliers in how people describe Johnson's time. So it can be tough. It depends how people get their information. Unfortunately, a lot of these documentaries, the color titles, they just don't factor. And it makes heavyweight seem a lot weaker than it was during this era. You know what I mean, Josh? Like there were more, it would be like if you only picked one alphabet title and you ignore the others. And then just focus on that one and say, that's really what's happening. And then you just don't mention the other stuff. That's sometimes what's happened in the way boxing history has been related. So it's just how it is. Like I noticed it on like it was the broadcast I was rewatching of Joe Louis, one of his fights. I'm trying to remember which one. Oh, might have been. I can't remember. But they were talking about how many times different heavyweight champs had defended the title. But they just don't bring up the color titles in that. So yeah, so like the way things are relayed through history is not necessarily the way they were spoken of in the day, or the way it was spoken of at various times isn't universal. So really sourcing is very, very important. You know this, Josh, when you do these great videos like Denver Ed, you have to go to different places, right, to get this information and to try and get perspective on a little bit of the nuance and not just find a version and go and run with it. Is that accurate? Oh. Is he still here, or did I talk him off the street? Oh, he's still here. Probably muted. Yeah, I think, but just getting back to this matchup, I think Aline Johnson, but early in the fight, it's going to be competitive and awesome because of the way Dempsey fought. Johnson's not going to have an option to have an exciting or not exciting fight. Do you think that's probably a comfortable prediction, Josh? It's going to be a badass fight early in the fight.
Yeah, I do think so. I think if you look at boxing history and both of their styles, then yeah, this tends to be something where it could be a very intense fight there in the early on. I imagine people would be on the edge of their seats just wanting to see what could potentially happen there through the early portion of the contest. And of course, the further it goes, then the less of that same intensity would probably be there, because I'd imagine the fight would have seen some ebbs and flows, and the real stylistic nature of each fighter would have taken hand. But always when you're in those early rounds, the intensity, especially what we know of both fighters, and had they fought during their respective times or in and around there, then we know that it would have been very polarizing. Just given the matchup, the magnitude would have been a huge match. As a matter of fact, Johnson Dempsey versus, it would have been more huge than Johnson Jeffries. We knew the implications of that and such, but it would have been an even larger matchup had it been Dempsey Johnson somewhere there around that same time, just given the offensive nature of Dempsey by comparison to Jeffries, who was offensive, of course, but certainly a very different type of fighter in terms of how he went about things. Now, but yeah, I think that, yeah, just a great matchup here to discuss. And just
let me pose a question at you. Here's a hypothetical, big man. So, yeah. Okay, so what if they had to make each other's title challenge, and in Johnson's case, unification? So what if Dempsey fought 1908, fought the emperor, the little dictator, Tommy Burns, Noah Brusso, in Australia, outdoors, in the Australian sun. So 1919, Dempsey is fighting late 1908, Tommy Burns, who was very busy when he was a champion. He was traveling around, making money, investing money, and kicking asses all over the world. So that's Dempsey's challenge. And Tommy Burns, very underrated fighter, even though he was a champion, very underrated because he was in the shadow of Jim Jeffries, the second biggest star in boxing behind Sullivan, who was just on another level, bodyguard for the president and shit. Like he's on his own level. But then and then Johnson has December 1908 version of Johnson. Instead of going to Australia to fight Burns, he's going to fight Big Jess Willard in 1919, inactive Jess Willard. How do you think those two fights go? Do you think Johnson, how dramatic would be the improvement on his results, if any, if he's fighting him in his 1908 form when he's around 200 pounds, probably 205? I'm not sure. I don't know if they weighed for the fight or if it was self-reported or guesstimated. I'm not sure. But Johnson a little bit lighter than when he fought Jeffries, maybe 10 pounds lighter than his Jeffries size.
Yeah.
But he's fighting the Willard that Dempsey beat, and then vice versa. How do you see Dempsey going against 5'7", hard-hitting Noah Brusso, a.k.a. Tommy Burns, a.k.a. the Dictator? Apparently, Tommy Burns in England, they call him the Dictator because he looked like Napoleon from 100-something years earlier.
Yeah,
and he does. I pulled that face. I'm like, oh yeah. And he also wore the hair. He had the little lick going down his forehead. He had the same square jaw and the butt chin, but he had like the little. He wore his hair in a similar way a lot of the time. He really did look like Napoleon. And his purse demands. So the Dictator was the Emperor was a good nickname, but the Dictator, because Tommy Burns didn't play around with the money, as you know, Josh.
Oh yeah, certainly. That's funny. I'm gonna look into that a bit more, but. To your question, for sure, I do think I'll start with. I think that Jack Dempsey, had he fought Burns, he ices Burns, and I think it would have been in quick fashion, maybe a round or two. I don't see it going past 2 rounds. And I like Tommy Burns. I think he was a good fighter. Of course, rose up in the weights, but I think that Dempsey would not have played it cautious at all, or wouldn't have played into the dynamic of what Johnson was dealing with in him facing Tommy Burns, that is. And I think Johnson, for that matter, could have.
Hey, Josh. Hey, real quick, there's someone in the chat that needs to be removed from the chat. That last comment, that's over the line. I'm not going to give them any further attention. You might want to nuke that real quick.
Oh yeah, it looks like it's not my chat. Am I able to do it? I don't know where he's coming. Oh yeah, I can. Oh yeah, I can do it.
All right, good looks. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Yeah. No attention. There are a lot of insecure people. A lot of people attach their egos to fighting, but fighting is an individual sport. It's a team effort, but it's an individual sport, and people are people. And just because we're talking about the color line, all these other excuses, just like money, it's just an excuse. That doesn't mean people need to get their egos involved in the comments. Goodbye, random hater. So back to the talk. Yeah, you were talking about you think Burns gets iced in maybe inside even a couple rounds. Dempsey's aggression. I think I agree with that. I think Burns' style, even though he was low set, Dempsey was really better against taller, upright fighters, and Burns was not like that. And he's underrated talent-wise, like Burns, and he could punch. But I do think that Dempsey, he's naturally heavier. He's naturally 15 pounds heavier. He's much taller. Range advantage, I believe. Or certainly not. He doesn't have shorter arms than Burns. Burns didn't have short arms. I think he had decent arms for his height. But in an absolute sense, like Sam Langford had long arms for his height, but he didn't actually have long arms. Like he didn't have 80-inch reach. And same with Burns. Like he had a good, what do they call it? The ape index. How much bigger your wingspan is than your height. So he was good in that measurement. But in absolute sense, Dempsey had the measurements, the advantage. And yeah, I think he gets him out of there. So what do you think about the other one? What if Johnson has to fight old Big Jess?
Yeah, kind of like Joshua Woods alluded in the comments. Joshua Woods said, I think a prime 1908 Johnson does beat that version of Willard, who was 37, out of shape and ready for the taking. Essentially, I'm certainly in agreement there with you, Random, as far as, or I'm in agreement with Joshua there as far as I think 1908 Johnson beats him beats Jess Willard, and I think he does it in rather comfortable fashion, I would say. Of course, we think about Willard and his power, his ability to absorb. I don't know that he stops Willard, but I think he outworks, beats Willard, and I think Willard's pretty much playing catch up for the entirety of the contest. And Willard certainly at that time coming in was pretty much not ready to maintain that championship that he had won over Johnson. So I think that any formidable heavyweight during that period of Willard's reign would have done the job, especially think about some that have reigned. I think a formidable heavyweight would have done the job, because when you slice it up, especially thinking about the one belt era, yeah, Willard's reign was one of the worst, really. He, in that 4-year span, or amount to around 4 years, he only defended his title in a draw with Frank Moran in a contest that, from what I've read, could have gone the other way, or could have gone in Moran's favor. And then his next contest was him getting starched by Dempsey. So I think that any top level guy, and I've mentioned it before, I think that Fred Fulton, had he fought Jess Willard at any point during his reign, I think he would have beat Jess Willard as well. Fred Fulton, I think he would have likely stopped Jess Willard.
Yeah, I agree with that. Fulton had a lot of stopping ability.
Yep, he was. And he had real power, and he goes a bit underrated, certainly, Fulton, that is. And I think that you could argue that, yeah, between he and Willard, who by virtue of being a heavyweight champion could have been considered the best heavyweight in the world, I think it was actually Fulton when, you just line the two of them up. So that's my opinion on it. So I think, yeah, when you flip those two situations around, both guys still get the win. Both guys, I think, do it in pretty solid and not too much of a challenging fashion. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's tough, because both of these champions, even though they were great fighters, they were very picky once they got to the pinnacle. And so, Johnson wasn't, he was fighting good fighters. It's not like O'Brien, Flynn, Moran, even battling Jim Johnson. None of them are chumps, not pushovers, just maybe not on his level. Al Kaufman. I mean, Al Kaufman was one. His manager gave him $50,000 to promote him for 2 years, which was a lot of money in that time. So Al Kaufman was considered like one of the top rising guys, but Johnson made him look incredibly easy.
With no doubt solid.
So it's like, but he's sort of like, so people in this time, because they were so busy as contenders, like Dempsey had been, people could miss their opportunity if the champ wasn't doing anything. Like if Dempsey had been a contender during Jack Dempsey's title reign, he probably wouldn't have gotten a shot. Dempsey wouldn't have given himself a shot. So Dempsey would have had to fight that 1918 schedule, 1919, 1920, 1921. Then he gets shop worn, and maybe then he'll get a shot. Like if you have a really picky champ and very few titles available, then you can do a tremendous amount. And that's what happened with Sam Langford, where he was fighting these amazing series against Hall of Fame rivals and doing all this stuff. And he's like just this legendary thing. People are well aware of it, but he's not getting a shot because the champ isn't interested. Turning down good money to not have the fight. And we see that in more recent years, like the whole debacle with Matchroom trying to get Wilder or Fury to come in and face Joshua. Dream matchups, just beautiful work, right? If they could make it happen. They got lots of money and went somewhere else, fought each other, tried to freeze Joshua out. Joshua was the guy with the resume. He was the guy with most of the belts. I know they say Fury lineal, but Fury beat Klitschko and then sat out. Like he wasn't like, it's almost like Jeffrey's lineal claim, right? Jeffrey's retired undefeated. he was one of the two champions. But, you know, like I said, a lot of the press, they were like, he's the only champion because the B League champion was Johnson when he retired, according to some, the racists. But it's like, was Jeffrey still like, does that lineal mean much in 1910 when he come? It meant a lot at the time, but does it mean much in a sporting sense? That the guy who calls it officially tells the world he's done in 05 when he comes back in 010. Well, with Fury had a few years off. So, I mean, I don't know how lineal that is, you know. So if a guy like happened with Joe Louis, if you leave when you're still in pretty good form and then you come back and you're past that form, does it mean as much? I don't think it means as much. It gets complicated and it stays complicated. It's not just today that things are a mess. And both of these guys, as great as they were very picky. So I think the world didn't get to see a whole lot of them at their very best.
Mm-hmm.
More so they saw Johnson at his very best because he was shut out. So he wasn't the guy slamming the door behind him like Dempsey had done. But once he got there, he'd done this huge body of work. And then in 1908, then he did start slamming the door on certain guys. But in spite of that, those are respectable opponents. I'm not going to talk bad about Al Kaufman or Jim Flynn or Stanley Catchell just because they were no match for Johnson. But we didn't see, you know, 1909 fights against McVeigh, Langford, Jeanette, or like past, not 1910, but like by 1912, you know, fights against the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. Other guys, you know, that can't get opportunity. They're the guys putting the seats. Sorry, brother?
I was saying underrated there, Jeff Clark.
Very much, you know, but so when Louis Angel Furbo's training for his title fight, who's coming into the camp to help him get ready? The Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. Can't get opportunity, but then they can train the guys who are getting the opportunity. It was a very unfair time. But, you know, just like in any industry, people you got to earn, you got to eat. So the guys would do it. They can't be like, on principle, I'm not going to. They're like, yo, you're going to pay me what? All right, I'm coming. It's money, you know, so it's a very complicated time. But I do think that both of these fighters left some question marks. Dempsey more than Johnson. Because Johnson did fight a pretty decent version of a who's who on his way to fighting and beating Tommy Burns. Not all of them. Some are bigger names than the actual challenge on the night. Like fighting that version of Fitz. Okay. That version of Fitz was not that was years past the heavyweight champion version of Fitz.
Right.
Or even the light heavyweight champion version of Fitz when Fitz beat George Gardner over 20 rounds, which is a really good win. George Gardner was awesome. Gave Jack Root his first loss, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, so that was, you know, but it's still a big name. Beating an ex-champ, even today, beating someone who was once a champion means something, even if they were just once an alphabet champion. So that's always been true. But it means more if you beat the guy when they're at their best. So unfortunately, an inactive champion creates questions in how much was the torch passed. Like when Ez beats Joe Louis, who's coming back. How close is that to beating Joe Louis at his best in the late 30s? When he was an absolute phenom, when they do finally fight, like how much is the torch passed? Is it all the way passed? I personally don't think so. Yeah, Joshua says Wills waited 7 years for Dempsey. Yeah, and it was when Wills was older than Dempsey. It was when Wills was old when they finally started talking about, oh, maybe we'll make that fight. Now you're 35. Waiting people out, that's not, you know, Floyd didn't invent that. Like, oh, you look like you've lost a step. We can make this fight. Floyd didn't invent that at all. Floyd is just the best at monetizing, targeting opponents and doing that, making gigantic amounts of money. That's part of his genius. But he didn't invent it. He just, you know, just like the shoulder roll, he didn't invent that shit either. But he sure used it to great effect. So Dempsey was, you know, it was about the money. He was drawing the color line, you know, officially or unofficially, he was drawing it, but it was also maximizing the money. So there are guys of a pale complexion that couldn't get opportunity just like in Johnson's reign, there were colored fighters, fellow colored fighters who couldn't get opportunity, and Johnson was the guy holding the door closed. So a very weird time, and I don't. Johnson has the better overall resume to me by far. Both great fighters. Johnson, I believe, is the greater fighter. Both of them not without controversy. Both of them denied people opportunities. So I don't want to give them too little or too much credit because they're undoubtedly great, but not without controversy. So it's worth mentioning both because I don't want to minimize these great pugilists, and they're also businessmen. They were both good businessmen. So I don't want to put too much critique on them, but I'm not going to leave it unsaid that like Johnson not fighting Sam Langford, that was like the biggest, other than Jeffries Johnson, that was the biggest fight possible for Johnson's title reign. It wasn't always possible to make it in every U.S. state. California, New York, certain states at different times clamped down on boxing or on fights or on certain controversial fights and stuff like that. But there was money available because it's an international sport even then. And so like in Australia, in England, Panama, Cuba, the fights could happen. Fights could happen places. There were promoters willing to, who knew they could make money off of those matchups. So Johnson didn't take on everyone. Dempsey didn't take on everyone. But before Johnson beat Burns, he was the guy who was taking on everyone. So he did spend a large part of his career and a lot of his prime doing that. So I give him a little bit more credit. Both greats, though. They both made my top. When I did the live stream with BL and Scrapbook, we did the top 10 heavyweights, each of us from what was it, 1900 to 1925?
Yeah, something to that too.
Dempsey, I think, was 6th, and I think I had Johnson 2nd to Langford.
Oh, okay. That's pretty dope right there.
So I hold Johnson in very high esteem, and Dempsey also 6th out of that whole era, 6th out of all those heavyweights in that time. That's pretty intense. But for that quarter century, well, it's 26 years. I didn't do the math. I was like 1900 to 1925. But
yeah, and as far as popularity and money generation, no question, he was the top dog.
He's the man. Great businessman, fighter. So that's something worth. While noting that the opportunity was denied certain people as far as like squeezing money for the athlete, at least that him specifically, he squeezed a lot of money out of the game for himself. Johnson was good at that himself. Dempsey was able to do movies and things. Johnson more like appearances, theater appearances. He could make a lot of money that way. So that and fighting, not B-tier fighters, but like A- tier fighters instead of fighting the A+ all-time greats that were available to him. Johnson could make a lot of money with that combination. Oh, I'll fight Al Kaufman. I'll do this theater run. That's going to make a lot of money collectively with less risk than fighting an all-time great in the prime. We've seen other guys do it. Whatever the reason stated, when there's a big money in a big fight, if people don't care about legacy, it's perfectly fine.
Right.
Like Floyd said, you can't spend legacy. Well, that's cool. You can, but you can buy it with propaganda. But in my book, you can't buy legacy either. So if you have less fights or easier fights because there's more money there, well, okay, that's cool. You're welcome to, but I'm not giving fight credit for that. Can't buy my love, So Johnson had I think Johnson had a much tougher career and faced more adversity than Dempsey by far. And so I consider him the greater fighter, but they were both ferocious. And in a head-to-head, greatness in a head-to-head, that's about the style and the approach that night. Do you see a rematch going any differently, Josh, than your predictions? A rematch between these. Sorry, that was a long and winding road to come back to the fight. But so if they fought once prime, if they had another one under similar conditions, do you think that goes any differently?
Yeah, I think that can certainly be factored in. I think it does to a certain degree. And I think both fighters could certainly build from a loss or whatever the outcome ultimately is, loss or win, So I could see an avenue where a rematch could be reversed. And by the same token, just given what we know of both fighters, I could see a situation where a rematch would be a more dominant victory as well. So I think, yeah, it just all depends on the timing of said rematch and sort of the mind state of each fighter coming into it. But both of them we know were iron willed, hard nosed. So you'd be hard pressed, in winning a battle of egos over either of these contestants. Certainly the case for Johnson. So I think, yeah, it could certainly vary, but both were capable of reversing the decision, most certainly. And one of the things I was going to mention, I was actually going to conclude with it, and it was brought up, but I was going to mention Harry Wills, who I think was an interesting fighter. And when I think about the heavyweight ranks and where I put the best heavyweights in the history of the sport, I rank Harry Wills high up there. And I do think that Harry Wills would have been the type of guy that at his peak would have defeated both of these fighters, but would have likely made for some very interesting contests with each of them as well, especially Dempsey, given the dynamic there from offensive standpoint, which is always the case with Dempsey. Just his prowess on offense makes him an interesting matchup for pretty much anyone in history. But Harry Wills was one of those guys who really didn't get an opportunity there at the title, and had he done so, I think he'd have been formidable enough to come away with the victory, whether either of these men held it and the time frame surrounding such. But in particular, the Harry Wills of 1918 through 1922, that is, I think was the best heavyweight in the world during that period. And Dempsey, of course, would have made it a hell of a fight, I feel, with Wills, and we likely would have had that on film. But yeah, overall, these are two great fighters in the history of the sport for so many different reasons. They both had trajectories and careers outside of just the typical for the heavyweight moneymaker at the time. They went through different points of adversity for each of them. And I'm with you. I do rate the resume of Jack Johnson's a bit higher than Dempsey's. And Dempsey was certainly a formidable fighter without a doubt. And honestly, one of my favorite fighters just to cover. And you've heard me mention it on numerous occasions. One of the historic references, or at least that intrigued me from a historic standpoint to get me interested in such, and actually watching these old black and white videos, with most certainly Dempsey's triumph over Willard. I just think that as far as my list of significant fights and how they personally make me feel, that's my number one right there. Just seeing Jack Dempsey at his absolute best and just destroying such a larger man when you really put it into context. And so salute to both of these fighters, really. And I think, yeah, this conversation, we could take it to even further avenues, of course, if we wanted to. But both, I think, hold well and hold strong. And with matchups like these, really no wrong answer. I think each or a case can be made for each of them. And, I'm just glad we have some footage and many accounts of both of these formidable champions in the heavyweight division. And when you tell the story of World Heavyweight Championship boxing, most certainly these are two of the most prominent, if not the most prominent stories in heavyweight history.
Yeah. And real quick, worst matchup for these guys. I think Johnson gets a bad rep, like people consider that he won on size, and that because he lost to Willard, although he was in his mid-30s, but the details, but because he lost to Willard, that other big fighters would be too big for him. But of course, that wasn't him at his best, and that was Willard at his best. And like Dempsey's treatment of Willard wasn't Willard at his best. Just like Tunney's getting the best of Dempsey, that wasn't the best version of Dempsey. That was years later. So I think for Johnson, like someone with a really great flicky jab, get Larry Holmes in there, get Ali in there, long arms, flicky jab, it's going to give him problems. It's going to be a lot harder for him to bat those away. They're not committing their weight in a way that, or even Jeff Clark, someone who's not committing their weight in a way that he can exploit, because he was a genius at that. And guys who are hard to tie up. So Ali, who could get in and out and dance around and just spread a stare in there, you know what I mean? That's going to give him more problems than guys who are just big and hit hard. Johnson was fine with guys who are big and hit hard at his best. With Dempsey, I think the worst matchup for him is someone like Sam Langford, who just had ridiculous experience and the ironest of iron chins, flat head, and a gigantic chest built for destroying people to the body as well as the head, and a long enough reach to get there. I think you take like a prime Sam Langford, like the 175-pound, slightly heavier prime version of Langford. 175 pounds going to eat Dempsey up.
Oh yeah,
that one style, because he's like, dude, I've seen lightweights use that style, like at lightweight speed, and you're 190 pounds doing it. And it's only like, say we take Langford 1912, that's like, so like less than a decade before, he'd been in there with like Joe Gans, Dave Holly, and Elbows McFadden, all these fast guys, and done just fine, and the welters too, Barbados Walcott, Tommy Sullivan, all these different dudes. He'd seen it all already from really fast dudes. So I think I'd take, if I had to just pick someone to go in and destroy prime Jack Dempsey, I'll take prime Sam Langford. And for Jack Johnson, I think I'll go with Ali. Ali or Holmes, or even like a Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis is a tough one because he was not only huge, but he was adaptable, and he had enough of a mean streak. When it did engage, it was pretty awesome. And I think Lewis is specifically a bad matchup for a lot of heavyweights. He's also a great fighter, one of the greatest of the modern heavyweights in my book. Top 10 heavyweight all time for me.
Oh yeah.
And just a great fighter and great competitor. And I think he's a bad matchup for a lot of people. Not a flicky jab guy, but man, his 1-2 was a thing of beauty. And when he really committed to it, it was scary. He's a big enough guy that when he really turned it on in those moments, it's very scary. Being bullied by a guy who's that huge, that's a guy who is too big for a lot of the guys, simply because he had different ways to approach the fight. So he's a bad matchup for a lot of dudes. But that doesn't mean he has the resume of other guys, and we didn't see him, and he was human, and he did have lapses in approach at times, but that happens with great fighters. I mean, Ray Leonard gave away early rounds against Duran in the first fight because he was sort of like doing that like clinch thing, but he's taking a lot of body shots and stuff. Duran's piling up points. That's a mistake. It cost him the fight pretty much, but it's, it doesn't mean he's not great. It's just like in the moment, these guys are trying to think, well, they're being attacked by experts at attacking people. It's crazy. It's a crazy sport. That's what makes it so fun. Raw aggression can overcome finesse and brilliance. You can rattle someone and it doesn't matter what they know if they can't think of it. So, but I don't think that's a problem with these two fighters. Dempsey, by 1919, he knocked out so many guys. In 1918, great year. And he was absolutely ready for his shot and made the most of it, set the world on fire. And Johnson wasn't getting rattled. He wasn't going to get rattled even when he was hurt. He'd shown he could get through a great deal. So yeah, great matchup. Josh, thanks for doing this. Thanks to the guys in the chat, to the people who made it all the way through, people listening afterwards. And this is good. We should do another. I'm surprised it went this long. I felt like we were wrapping up around the hour mark, and then I think I went on some random tangents. Talk about everything else.
It was all good. No, great discussion. Yeah, we'll have to do another one.
Yeah, and I agree. I think Harry Will's misfortune was his prime overlapped with Dempsey's.
Right.
Like literally overlapped. Like 18, Dempsey's best year. Will's was a monster that year. 19, 20, 21, 22. Because Will's had cut his teeth fighting all the guys that Jack Johnson wouldn't fight at that point in their careers. So he was fighting McVeigh. He's fighting Langford. He's fighting Jeanette. So Will's got the experience from the all-time greats in or close enough to their prime to that when he hit his prime, it was absolutely scary. It's really scary. And he had an enormous reach. So he'd punish Dempsey. He'd be able to punish Dempsey because he'd fought some of the great punchers. at heavyweight already.
Yeah.
Guys with more experience than Dempsey, guys who've been through wars. Like Dempsey never had a 49-round performance.
Right.
So you're fighting Sam McVeigh, who fought one of the great cardio machines of all time, or fighting Jeanette, who was the great cardio machine. These are guys who went into the 49th, or like past 20 rounds is crazy. Past 15, past 12 today would be extreme. Past 15 would be, in recent decades, a lot. Past 20, but getting up into the 40s, that's absolutely silly. And that wasn't their only fight that year. They fought each other 3 times that year. Imagine that. Which was the short one? It was 20 rounds. Well, holy cow.
Right.
20, 30, and 49. So this is the kind of guys we're talking about. Real Iron Men, like guys cut from steel. So Dempsey was really tough, but he also had a PR machine behind him. So he wasn't like a lot of these guys were made of iron. Wasn't just him. He had the marketing to go with it, which made it special for people. And so I mean, he was incredibly tough, great fighter. But yeah, a lot of these guys are absolute Iron Men. I think Will's that's his misfortunes. His prime overlapped with a fighter who wasn't going to give him a shot to unify those title claims at a time when that guy could make a ton of money without doing it, without the fight. So it's just what it was, but we celebrate them all here. Guys can avoid fights and still be great, because there are other fighters from more recent decades who avoid certain matchups. Didn't Canelo just ask for $200 million to do a matchup?
He did.
Yeah, so that's cool. That's the FU money. He's like, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want this fight, but if you give me this much, I'll get over it. Okay, that's cool, but that's it. You don't then say they'll fight anybody, because that's pricing yourself out. Someone might stretch themselves and meet that money, but you're basically pricing it out of a reasonable chance of happening. So it's just whatever. It's not new. It's been happening since forever. I was reading. I was trying to think who it was that was trying to get a fight with Tommy Gibbons, but he wanted like $200,000, which was more than he'd ever made in his career at that point. I can't remember. I'll do it on a different live stream. But yeah, people price themselves out. It happens. Even great fighters do that sometimes. Oh, hold on a second. We got the good comments on Johnson here. Dempsey was great when his opponents backed down, but Johnson wouldn't have that problem. Also, the many clips of guys coming in just like Dempsey did, got hit by a monster uppercut from Johnson. Very, very true. I think I agree with the idea of Dempsey having big chances in the early rounds. That's well put, Eudes. Dempsey was a fearsome thing and can't necessarily be judged, even though it's due to his own decisions, can't necessarily be judged by how he looked late in his career. Like when he was absolutely fine-tuned, he was definitely a threat. Johnson was a human being with a human chin. But as that fight wears on, because Johnson, he fought some guys who were scrappy. It wasn't like a thin resume. Like when we were doing the part 1 of that, Sam Langford, Jack Johnson, doing the lead up of their careers up to their 1906 fight, right, Josh? We went through Johnson's early career. He fought some guys and had a series against some of these dudes. So he'd already been through the fire. Great careers, both of these guys, though. But very, very important to boxing history structurally. Controversial, like we said, but still great fighters, great businessmen fighters as well. So I think, Josh, I think we've gone on this. We could obviously do some circles, but I think we've pretty much killed this one magnificently. So I think we're saying Dempsey has a chance in the early rounds. Johnson probably favored the longer it goes. Prime.
Yep. Certainly, I think I'd lean more in that range as well, for sure. I would leave it at that. But certainly both very much capable of pulling it off, just depending on the circumstances and all, which is what makes this great and interesting. And I do thank you, Random, for letting me be a part of this. I think it was a great discussion as well. And hey, it brings about some more intriguing discussions we can have here as far as some of these great heavyweights and what if fantasy matchups that could have potentially taken place.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to do, like, one I've been thinking about is trying to pair Ezra Charles when he was at heavyweight with someone really big, because he was brilliant He gave up 30 pounds to Joe Louis. A little bit older or not, that was still Joe Louis. That was a good fight too. You want to know how great Ezra Charles was? Watch his fight with Joe Louis. Even knowing that's a little older Joe Louis, but like actually watching the fight, Ezra Charles, he was so special. That guy had some cojones. He wasn't like I'm just going to be out here all safe, like we sometimes see great fighters do. He had some cojones and he had the technique to capitalize. Really great stuff. Maybe Ezra Charles, Harry Wills. Maybe the Ezra Charles that beat Joe Louis that night versus the Harry Wills. One of Harry Wills' great performances from, like 18 to 22, right?
Yeah.
So Wills from 18 to 22, and then maybe we can just pair Wills against some of the other great heavyweights in history.
Mm-hmm.
Certain styles are going to be good for him. Certain ones are bad. Like Wills Dempsey is actually a really good fight. Maybe that's one of the ones we should look at.
Yeah.
That would have been a phenomenal fight. That might have been one of the fights of the decade as far as the action, because what Wills was capable of and his dimensions and his capabilities, how he knew how to use his size and those vicious body shots he learned to throw from far out. Because he was so long, he could really tag the body without getting it all up in the business. But then Dempsey against tall fighters, Dempsey was best against tall fighters. Wills wasn't necessarily as upright as he would want him to be, but not like Fulton or Willard. But that's so stylistically that actually gives Dempsey a good chance, even though he's going to be a little bit lighter and the dimensions aren't the same. I like that one. Maybe we'll do some variations on that. We'll talk about it, Josh. Thanks so much for coming on, man. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, indeed. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. The whole nine. Udis, I think I still say it wrong. Joshua, and the likes of him, Joseph Phoenix, Dan, Max, everyone who dropped by. Skywalker dropped by. We had
Udis for the great comments on
Don't Be a Sucker.
on Dempsey and Johnson. Those are good. I think that's reasonable because you can't write off someone like Jack Dempsey early in a fight,
right?
Because he's going to bring it. But he's also a human being. Like all these guys, they're also human beings. So there's always a bad style matchup, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the best overall fighter. Like I think Jeff Clark makes about 190, maybe 195 pounds. It is like best in shape. He's with his long arms and his jabbing style. He's a bad matchup for certain guys, and then not a bad matchup for other guys. And then it will also come down to the reffing and the size of the ring and stuff like that. Like there's certain guys like you could just bring him in like a closer in baseball. Like you're a specifically bad matchup for this dude. And I think Dempsey is actually stylistically like fighting a really tall fighter. He's swimming up with those hooks. Wills isn't like the opposite of what Dempsey wants to fight. It's just that Wills is so great. He's not like your average version of that build. So I think that's kind of intriguing. But I think, Josh, we've reached a great stopping point. Thanks, everyone, for coming by. Thank you, Josh, for your participation and for banning the trolls. That's always nice.
Yep, thank you.
And folks will be back. And the next thing I'm doing that I'm aware of on the channel is going to be a discussion with Scrapbook and the Boxing Librarian, which I believe we're going to have to push back for a week. BL's dealing with the throat thing. It's like a little painful to talk. So I think we're actually going to do it next Friday. I'm pretty sure we've confirmed we're going to do that. So then maybe there's something in between. Maybe, Josh, if you want to do another one, just let me know, brother.
All right. Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Take it easy.